She stood in the marble-floored lobby, her worn heels clicking softly against the polished tiles, a thin folder clasped tightly in her trembling hands, and though the towering building of Whitaker Industries loomed above her like a mountain too steep to climb, she drew in a breath filled with hope and desperation alike, because this wasn't just another attempt at a job. It was her last shot before she'd have to choose between another night in her battered old car or a shelter bed if one was even available. Evelyn Parker wasn't what anyone would call a typical job applicant anymore, not with her thinning coat, her thrift store blouse, and eyes that had seen far more than a resume could ever capture, but despite the ache in her knees and the invisible weight pressing on her shoulders, she walked with purpose, dignity clinging to her like a second skin, because she had promised herself that today would be different, that she wouldn't let the pain of her past silence her voice anymore. Just 5 years earlier, Evelyn had been the cheerful office administrator everyone leaned on, the one who organized birthdays and brought cupcakes for the janitor's kids, who stayed late to help interns understand reports and still made it home in time to kiss her husband goodnight, and life, though modest, was sweet, with Sunday morning pancakes and Friday movie nights and laughter that made the walls of their tiny apartment feel like a castle, until one night when her husband, Marcus, collapsed in the kitchen and everything changed. The diagnosis was brutal and swift: pancreatic cancer. And from that moment on, Evelyn's life became a blur of hospital corridors, whispered prayers, and unpaid bills piling up like snow she couldn't shovel fast enough, and after a long and agonizing fight, she lost him, and in the silence that followed his last breath, something inside her cracked in ways she didn't fully understand until she found herself unemployed, alone, and unable to keep up with rent. Eviction followed. Then couch surfing, then shelters, and finally, her car, her last possession, became her bedroom, her closet, and her sanctuary all in one. But even then, Evelyn refused to let the darkness consume her, volunteering at women's shelters, tutoring kids at public libraries, and telling herself each morning as she stared into her cracked visor mirror, "You still matter." It was during one of those tutoring shifts that she overheard a conversation between two janitors discussing how the CEO of Whitaker Industries, Miles Whitaker, had once given a job to a former convict simply because he believed everyone deserved a second chance, and though Evelyn had nothing in common with that man's story, she understood the feeling of being dismissed, unseen, and she decided then that she would try, even if it meant being turned away at the door, because at least then she would know she hadn't given up. So there she was, standing in front of the receptionist's desk with her resume tucked inside a frayed folder, asking softly, "Is there any way I could speak to Mr. Whitaker, just for 5 minutes?" And though the woman behind the desk gave her the practiced smile of someone who turned away dozens of hopefuls before, something in Evelyn's eyes must have struck a chord, because instead of sending her away, she picked up the phone and murmured, "There's someone here, a walk-in applicant," and what followed was a blur. An elevator ride that felt like a rocket launch, her reflection in the polished doors looking fragile yet fierce, and then, the moment she stepped into the glass-walled office of one of the city's most powerful men, Miles Whitaker looked up from his laptop, his expression neutral but not unkind, and as he glanced at her resume, a page that now seemed embarrassingly thin compared to the weight of her story, he asked, "No appointment?" And she replied, steadying her voice, "No, sir. I just hoped you'd give me 5 minutes," and maybe it was the honesty in her voice or the fact that he'd once been on the other side of rejection himself, but he leaned back in his chair and gestured for her to sit, and so, with her hands resting on her lap and her heart pounding in her ears, Evelyn told him everything. Not as a plea for sympathy but as proof that she was still here, still standing, still willing to work harder than anyone else if someone would just give her the chance, and she spoke of her work history, her skills, how she had managed office budgets, coordinated events, handled crises without flinching, and how, in the last 2 years, she'd applied to over 300 jobs, often with no reply at all. She didn't cry, though her voice trembled once or twice, and when she finished, the room was silent for a beat that felt like forever, until Mr. Whitaker leaned forward and asked a question that made her breath hitch, "Would you start tomorrow if I said yes?" And the tears she'd been holding back spilled over as she nodded, her hands covering her mouth in disbelief, and in that moment, the dam broke, not just in her but in something larger, something spiritual, as if the universe itself had decided she had earned her redemption. True to his word, Mr. Whitaker personally walked her to HR, where she was on board as an executive assistant, and from her first day, Evelyn poured every ounce of herself into her work, not just to prove herself, but because she believed in giving back to the company that had restored her dignity. She arrived early, stayed late, brought ideas to streamline operations, mentored interns with patience and warmth, and soon, people began to notice, not just the quality of her work but the way she uplifted others, the way she remembered birthdays, asked after sick relatives, left notes of encouragement on colleagues' desks, and when she saved the company thousands by redesigning a vendor invoicing system, she was promoted to senior operations coordinator. But even with success, Evelyn never forgot where she came from. She still volunteered on weekends, started a donation drive at the office for transitional housing residents, and launched a mentorship program for women re-entering the workforce after hardship, and little by little, her story began to spread, first among employees, then in a company newsletter, and eventually, in a viral article titled, "She Walked into a CEO's Office with a Resume," and changed a company's heart. When asked in interviews what motivated her, Evelyn always said the same thing: because someone once believed in me when they didn't have to, and that belief became the cornerstone of a new outreach initiative led by Whitaker Industries to hire people from underserved backgrounds, train them, and give them a second chance. Through it all, Evelyn stayed humble, still riding the bus some mornings, still packing her lunch, still holding on to the weathered folder that had held her resume the day her life turned around, and on the 3rd anniversary of her hiring, Mr. Whitaker surprised her during an all-hands meeting by announcing that the company would be establishing the Evelyn Parker Foundation, dedicated to job placement, career mentorship, and emergency assistance for people facing economic hardship. The applause was thunderous, but Evelyn's tears came silently, her hand pressed to her chest as if trying to hold her heart together, and as she looked out over the crowd of co-workers, many of whom had become dear friends, she thought of Marcus, of their little apartment, of the nights she had cried herself to sleep in a cold car and whispered to the stars, "Just give me one more chance," and now, standing under bright lights with love surrounding her, she realized those prayers hadn't gone unheard. Years later, when she stood on stage at a national leadership summit, invited as a keynote speaker, she began her speech with the words, "I am not special, but I am proof that kindness is," and the crowd listened, not because she was famous or rich, but because she spoke the language of humanity, of resilience, of grace in the face of despair. And long after the event ended, people wrote to her from all over the world, single mothers, veterans, recent graduates, the unemployed, the lost, telling her that her story had given them the courage to keep going, to keep knocking on doors even when they felt invisible. And Evelyn answered every letter, often with handwritten notes that said, "You still matter, don't stop believing in yourself." And so, her journey, born from grief, forged through struggle, and lifted by a single act of compassion, became more than a personal redemption arc. It became a lighthouse for others, a reminder that every life has value, that the doors we open for others sometimes change the course of history, and that in a world so often divided by indifference, the power of one "yes" can echo far beyond the moment it's spoken. And though she never sought recognition, Evelyn's story became a legacy, a living testament to the simple but profound truth that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin quietly, with a woman, a resume, and the courage to walk into a room that was never meant for her, and claim her place with nothing but grace, grit, and the unshakable belief that she still had something to give.